The vintage vinyl store owner held the Rolling Stones album just out of reach and looked at the scruffy customer with undisguised skepticism. "This is $5,000. It's signed by Keith Richards himself. I'm not sure this is in your price range." Keith Richards, who'd wandered into the shop to kill an hour before a recording session, looked at the album and immediately saw something wrong with the signature. It was forged, and badly. When he pointed this out, the owner actually laughed. "Oh, so now you're an authentication expert? Look at you. You can't even afford a decent jacket, but you're going to tell me about valuable signatures?" Keith didn't raise his voice, didn't get angry, just pulled out his wallet, took out his driver's license, and placed it on the counter next to the album. The name on the ID? Keith Richards. The address? The house where he'd supposedly signed this album. What the store owner said next, and what Keith did to prove the signature was fake, became legendary in the world of music memorabilia. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in London, 1987. Keith Richards had 3 hours before he needed to be at Olympic Studios for a mixing session. He'd been driven through Notting Hill when he spotted a small vintage record shop he'd never noticed before. Holloway's Vinyl and Memorabilia, painted in faded gold letters on the window. On impulse, Keith asked his driver to pull over. "Give me an hour," he said. "I just want to browse." Keith loved record shops, always had. Even after decades of making records himself, there was something magical about walking into a shop and seeing albums lined up, waiting to be discovered. He pushed open the door, triggering a small bell, and stepped into the cramped, musty-smelling space. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with vinyl, CDs, posters, and various pieces of rock memorabilia. The shop was empty except for the owner behind the counter, a man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan, reading a catalog. He looked up briefly at Keith, took in the worn leather jacket, the unwashed hair, the general appearance of someone who'd been on the road too long, and returned to his catalog without a greeting. Keith didn't mind. He preferred browsing without assistance. He started in the jazz section, flipping through albums methodically, the way serious collectors do. Then he moved to blues, then rock. He was in the R section, Rolling Stones, naturally, when something caught his eye. There, behind a plastic protective sleeve, was a copy of Exile on Main Street. The album itself was pristine, a first pressing from 1972 by the look of it. But what made Keith stop cold was the signature scrawled across the cover in silver marker, Keith Richards, with a small guitar sketch underneath. And the price tag? £5,000, authenticated. Keith carefully pulled the album from the rack and studied it under the shop's dim lighting. The signature was wrong, not subtly wrong, but obviously wrong to anyone who actually knew Keith's signature. The R in Richards had this elaborate loop that Keith had never used. The I had a dot, which Keith always omitted. The slant was wrong. Keith's signature tilted slightly left, this one tilted right. And that guitar sketch? Keith had never drawn a guitar next to his signature, not once in 40 years. This was a forgery, a decent one, good enough to fool someone who'd only seen a few examples of Keith's signature, but still obviously fake to Keith himself. He wondered how many other forgeries this shop had sold over the years. "Excuse me," Keith called to the owner, still holding the album. "Could you tell me about this one?" The owner looked up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. He stood and walked over, his expression suggesting Keith was wasting his time. "The Exile album? That's a very valuable piece, signed by Keith Richards himself after a concert in 1972. It's been authenticated by experts. £5,000. Keith nodded slowly. "And you're certain it's authentic?"
The owner's eyes narrowed. "I've been in this business for 35 years. I don't sell forgeries. That signature has been verified by 2 separate experts. It comes with certificates of authenticity, which I can show you if you're seriously interested in purchasing." "The thing is," Keith said carefully, "I don't think this is real. This signature, it's not right. The R is wrong, the slant is wrong, that guitar drawing doesn't belong there." The owner's face flushed. "Are you suggesting I'm selling a fake?" Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I'm Richard Holloway. I've authenticated signatures for auction houses, for museums, and you're, he gestured vaguely at Keith's appearance, what exactly? An expert? Keith kept his voice calm. I'm just saying I've seen a lot of Keith Richards' signatures over the years, and this doesn't look right. Holloway actually laughed, a condescending sound that filled the small shop. Oh, so now you're an authentication expert? Look at yourself. You walk in here wearing a jacket that looks like it's been through a wood chipper. You probably haven't washed your hair in a week, and you think you're qualified to tell me about valuable signatures? He took the album from Keith's hands. This signature is real. It's been authenticated. And frankly, at £5,000, it's completely out of your price range anyway, so I'm not sure why we're having this conversation. Keith stood very still. He'd dealt with people like this his entire life, people who judged him based on appearance, who made assumptions about who he was and what he could afford. Usually it didn't bother him. But there was something particularly galling about being told you couldn't afford your own signature on an album you'd actually made. What if I could prove it's not authentic? Keith asked quietly. Holloway set the album down on the counter with exaggerated care. And how exactly would you do that? Do you have forensic equipment? Access to authenticated comparison signatures? A degree in document analysis? Keith reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was a worn leather thing, held together with a rubber band, containing some cash, a few credit cards, and his driver's license. He took out the license and placed it on the counter, right next to the album with the forged signature. Holloway looked down at the license. His expression went through several stages. First confusion. Why was this customer showing him identification? Then focus, as he read the name on the license, then disbelief, as his brain tried to reconcile what he was reading with what he was seeing, then horror, as the full implication hit him. The license read Keith Richards, with an address in West Wittering. The photo showed the same weathered face, the same sharp eyes, the same unmistakable features of the man standing in front of him. That's not possible. Holloway's voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. That's not possible. It's possible, Keith said gently, and it's true. I'm Keith Richards, and that signature on the album is fake. I've never seen this album before in my life. I didn't sign it in 1972 or any other year. Holloway looked from the license to Keith's face to the album and back again, his mind clearly racing. But the certificates, the authentication, are also fake or wrong. Either way, that's not my signature. Holloway sank onto a stool behind the counter, the color draining from his face. I paid £8,000 for that album 3 years ago, from a collector in Manchester. He had documentation, provenance, everything. Then he conned you, Keith said, not unkindly, and you've been trying to con whoever bought it from you, probably not intentionally, but still.
Holloway looked at the album with new eyes, seeing the flaws Keith had pointed out. The R is wrong, he said quietly, more to himself than to Keith. And you don't dot the I. And that guitar drawing, I thought it was charming. I thought it added value. It adds suspicion, Keith said. I've signed thousands of albums over the years. I've never once drawn a guitar. Why would I? I play guitar. That's like a plumber drawing a toilet next to his signature. Despite everything, Holloway almost smiled at that. So this is worthless? The album itself is valuable, Keith said. First pressing, good condition, that's worth maybe £200–300. But the signature? He shook his head. Sorry, mate. Holloway put his head in his hands. Do you know how many I've sold? How many collectors I've told this was authenticated? I've built my reputation on knowing signatures, on never selling fakes. Keith felt a surprising amount of sympathy for the man. You're not the first person to be fooled by a good forgery. There's a whole industry of fake signatures out there. Some of them are incredibly convincing. Just not this one, Holloway said bitterly. Not this one, Keith agreed. Then, after a moment, tell you what, how about I sign it, for real this time? Then you'll have something actually valuable, and you can compare the two signatures, see the difference. Holloway looked up, hope and confusion warring on his face. You'd do that? After what I said about your jacket? And, yeah, well, you weren't entirely wrong about the jacket, Keith said with a slight smile. It has been through some things. But yes, I'll sign it. Do you have a silver marker? Holloway scrambled to find one, his hands shaking slightly. Keith took the marker and the album, carefully positioning it on the counter. Watch how I sign it, he said. The R is simple, no loops. The I has no dot. The whole thing tilts slightly left, like I'm always in a hurry, and no decorations, just the name. He signed it quickly, effortlessly, the signature of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. When he finished, he placed it next to the forged one. The difference was immediately obvious. The real signature looked natural, flowing, part of the moment. The fake looked deliberate, careful, like someone copying homework. See, Keith said, yours looks like someone trying to sign my name. Mine looks like me signing my name. That's always the tell with forgeries. They're too careful, too perfect sometimes, or too imperfect in the wrong ways. Holloway studied both signatures for a long moment. I've been selling fakes, he said quietly, for years probably. Not just you. I've got Beatles signatures, Zeppelin, Hendrix. What if they're all fake? They might be, Keith said honestly, or they might be real. But you should probably have them checked by someone who actually knows, not just certificate companies. Anyone can make a certificate. You need someone who's compared real signatures to fakes hundreds of times.
Holloway nodded slowly. Then he looked at Keith with something approaching respect. What you said earlier about proving it was fake, I thought you were just another customer trying to negotiate the price down. I've had people try everything. I never thought, he gestured helplessly, that I might actually be me, Keith finished. Yeah, I get that a lot. People expect me to show up with bodyguards and handlers and a whole scene, but sometimes I just want to look at records. I'm sorry, Holloway said, about what I said, about the jacket, the hair, the everything. Keith waved it off. Forget it. But do me a favor. If you're going to keep selling memorabilia, learn to spot the fakes, because there are a lot of people out there selling forgeries, and they're getting better at it every year. How do you spot them? Holloway asked, if you don't mind me asking. Keith thought about it. The same way you spot anything fake. You learn what real looks like first. You study it. You see enough real signatures, you start to notice when something's off. It's like I can tell if a guitar is out of tune in 3 seconds, not because I have perfect pitch, but because I've been playing for so long that wrong just feels wrong. Same with signatures. That one felt wrong the second I saw it. Holloway carefully took the album, now with Keith's real signature alongside the fake. This is probably the most valuable thing in my shop now, authenticated by the actual person in front of me with me watching. I should probably not sell it. Keep it as a reminder to be more careful. Or sell it and use the money to get proper training in authentication, Keith suggested. Either way, you'll know better next time. Keith left the shop 20 minutes later, leaving behind a stunned owner and an album that would become legendary in the memorabilia world, the only known example of Keith Richards' signature directly next to a forgery of his signature, signed specifically to demonstrate the difference. The story spread through the collecting community within days. Holloway, to his credit, used the incident to become more careful about authentication. He reached out to experts, learned proper verification techniques, and became known as one of the more honest dealers in London,
someone who'd openly admit when he couldn't verify a signature rather than pretending certainty. And that album? It never got sold. Holloway kept it behind the counter permanently, showing it to other dealers, to collectors, to anyone who wanted to learn how to spot a fake. This, he'd say, pointing to the forged signature, is what happens when you judge books by their covers. And this, pointing to Keith's real signature, is what happens when you listen and learn. If this powerful story about assumptions, forgeries, and the lasting value of humility moved you, remember that expertise can walk in wearing a beat-up leather jacket,